We have been reading and reflecting on a passage from Avi Reynolds' work, and the passage relates to the nature of the modern political and social order. Especially, we are focusing on the nature of the modern state, which is emerging in this passage. And so far, we had looked at a few interconnected things. Let us go over them briefly for the sake of continuity. So far we have seen that the modern political and social orders, in fact, we can say that the modern civilizational order is based on the concept of interest. And when we talk about political order, especially the state, the interest which we are looking at is not a particular interest of an individual or a group, but general interest. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that the sole and absolute right to decide what is general interest lies with the people. And on this absolute authority of the people lies the foundation of modern state and the notion of sovereignty. The sovereign power is the people, in theory. So it's the people who decide what is in the general interest in terms of policies, in terms of institutions, and so on. But the third thing which we looked at was that although in theory people decide what is general interest or what is interest, in practice, once we dedicate ourselves to the sovereignty of interest or the primacy of interest as individuals or as society or as civilization, in practice what we dedicate ourselves to is the sovereignty of desires. Sovereignty of desire. Sovereignty of desire. That's the practical form the notion of interest takes. And we can argue for that, and we sort of argued a bit in the previous session, historically, on historical basis, and also from the viewpoint of practical, historically as well as conceptually. Because the way interests were defined were materially. And even if you talk about non-material interests, they require material foundations or material means to be fulfilled. So that brings in, anchors interest in material. And the form interest, the priority of interest take is the satisfaction of human desires. Pleasure or pain. And pleasure is when your desire is fulfilled. And pain is when your desire is hindered or frustrated. And modern moral philosophy, especially utilitarianism, argues that general interest law is in the maximization of pleasure and minimization of pain. But once you dedicate yourself to desire, it is desires which become masters, not you, whether it's individual or society or civilization. So sovereignty of general interest basically means sovereignty of desire, and the form which this sovereignty of desire takes in modern human society is the sovereignty of capital. And capital is anything whose sole purpose is to increase itself. That's what we call accumulation for the sake of accumulation. Accumulation for the sake of accumulation. For the sake of accumulation. And that's what we in any political or social order based on the sovereignty of capital is known as capitalism. So basically, sovereignty of interests leads to the sovereignty of desires, which leads to the sovereignty of capital. So it's the logic of capital which decides eventually. Logic of capital accumulation, which ultimately decides what policies to pursue. The nature of institutions and the nature of individual social and political order. On the whole, the nature of civilization. And another thing which we looked at was that in this, and especially Abby Reynolds is writing in 18th century, I guess, or the start of the, or somewhere in the 19th century, 18th. So 18th and 19th century, the struggle to establish this sovereignty is still going on. So, and the main institutions from which this sovereignty was fetched, stolen, or was the Catholic religion. So the main threat to this nascent order is this religion, which with its counterclaim, because like the monotheistic God, there can be only one sovereign, either it is capital or religion or anything else. So religion is important because of the historical context, because before the sovereignty of capital, it was the sovereignty of the feudal Christian religious civilization, which was a reality in Europe, where this struggle is taking place. So for that historical reason, the modern state is always very sensitive towards the religion because of its historical memory. But in general, any other institution which sovereignty is something, this sovereignty of capital, something absolute and totalizing. And the political and social order which is based on this sovereignty is also absolute and totalizing. So that's why it cannot tolerate any potential or actual rivals. It's not that it cannot tolerate the existence of any rivals, but it cannot tolerate the existence of any viable and potential rival. So once this viability is decimated and this potential is eradicated, this new political order may provide a space for diversity of things. But what it cannot tolerate is any viable, potential, or actual rivals. And this is true for any manifestation of modern political orders. A lot of commentator thinks that this is unique to some French, especially given what is happening in France at the moment. French modernity or something. I mean, French modernity has its, sensitivities, and it's not as strong as other modernities. But from this, it doesn't follow that liberal Anglo-Saxon liberal versions are more mild in this sense. I think what they differ is in their management and their assessment of rivals, and not their actual ferocity. If they actually come to realize that there is a viable, potential, or actual rival. And that's clear from, for example, Rawls's work in political liberalism, for example. We said that any potential and actual rivals to the modern political capitalist liberal order should be treated as viruses, and they should be dealt as such. So that's the background. So let's look at the rest of the paragraph from where we left it last time. So we had stopped here. It pertained to this authority and this authority alone. And by this authority means the people or the sovereign power in which this authority is invested alone has the right to judge of any institution, whatever, whether it conforms to the general interest. And as we saw in practice, that authority actually belongs to capital and the agents of capital, and not people as such. And that's true for different ideologies, true for liberalism, true for social democracy, true for nationalism, capitalist nationalism, and true for socialism. So it pertained to this authority. Now let's read the authority of the capital. And to this authority alone, to examine the dogmas and discipline of religion. Dogmas to make sure that, contrary to common sense, they would not expose peaceful order. Peaceful order, by peaceful order, what he means that the absolute sovereignty of the capital. To disturbance and made all the more dangerous by the fact that the dogmatic ideas of happiness to come are combined with the zeal for God's glory and submission to truth that are regarded as revelation and discipline, to a saying that it doesn't okay. So it belongs to the. So generally, it's thought that modern secularism leaves religion alone, as long as it doesn't interfere in politics. But this minimalist conception of secularism doesn't belong to modernists, because this minimalist conception of secularism assumes that modern state is a minimalist state. But minimalist state is just a fiction. Modern state is in its various forms. It's not a minimalist state. It's not a minimalist state. It is a total housing state. So that's why it's important that he's saying that it is within the jurisdiction of modern state to assess the dogmas of religion, to make sure not just that they don't interfere in the political order, but to make sure that those religious dogmas are not any viable potential or actual threat to the absolute sovereignty of modern state. And any freedom which religion is granted are within this bound, as Kant famously said, religion in the bound of reason alone. And that reason is the reason of capital or modern sovereignty in this context. And it's not just French state or nationalist state or absolutist state or socialist states which does that, assess the dogmas. Liberal states do it all the time. The only thing is, because this fact is mostly accomplished in modern liberal democracies, has been accomplished through hundreds of years, of centuries, of at least 200 or 300 years of violence and purge, through which religion has been reshaped to make it compatible with and subservient to the sovereignty of capital. It doesn't need that sort of unabashed violence and interference, so it can let religion. It can leave religion alone, but this required centuries of violence and purge and reshaping and all those things in all modern liberal Western democracies and non-Western liberal democracies. And you can see this through the sort of interference which modern liberal states practice towards societies and states, especially societies which are either unwilling to fully subsume them under the capitalist political order, or in the eyes of those liberal states, they have a actual potential to stand up to the liberal and the capitalist order. You will see that interference, as you will see it clearly, for example, in Pakistan. American pressure and it to reform religious curriculum in Pakistani school and universities, uh, and especially Imran Khan's government has been very happy to oblige to American wishes in this regard. So you in America's religious policy towards Pakistan, for example, you can see this thing that it pertains to the authority. This authority to examine the dogma and discipline of religion. So, like all talk of purging, certain verses from the Quran and all those things. So dogmas make sure they're contrary to common sense. They would not peaceful order. Peaceful order mean capitalist order, like the so. Even if commits violence against, it's peaceful to the extent that it's peaceful towards the capital. So to make sure that they would not expose peaceful disturbances. So these religion. So those dogmas should be purged, which can challenge the authority of the capitalist order. All the more dangerous by the fact that dogmatic ideas of it. So dogmatic ideas of happiness ideas of happiness. Dogmas to make sure the contrary is common said they would not expose people to this made all the more dangerous by the fact that dogmatic ideas of a happiness to come, like eternal happiness. Which is like in Islamic literature, for example, Ghazali call it Sa'adat, or the eternal happiness, combined with the zeal. So this idea of eternal happiness is dangerous because it directly challenges the notion of the sovereignty of general interest, because the sovereignty of general interest basically is founded on forgetting the eternal happiness and prioritizing the happiness in this world or pleasure in this world over any other happiness. And this idea of eternal happiness is dangerous because it directly challenges the idea of the sovereignty of pleasure and desire and their sovereignty. And this eternal happiness, our dogmatic idea of happiness, become even more dangerous when they combine with the zeal. With the intention, for the glory of God. It's like you're trying to establish the law of God on this earth. And some submission to the truth that are regarded as so truth. The modern order is not based on truth, it is based on desire. So if you dedicate yourself to desire, then the truth and its glory and zeal for it poses direct threat to that order. So these sort of religion needs to be tamed, reformed, reformulated. And these ideas either needs to be purged or to be moderated in the inverted commas, so that they are either compatible or they are subservient to the political order and they don't pose any viable threat. And this is what happened with the Catholic Church in 100 years through different council is basically submitted to this order. Uh, uh, and the last one, important one, was in 1960s, I think. And through those submission, it finally earned its right to exist as a subservient institution within capitalist order. The glorious symbols that are regarded as. Okay, I think we just let's go back to text, and then we'll stop there and continue from here next time. So it pertains to this authority, that the authority of capital, and this authority alone, to examine the dogmas and disciplines of religion, not just dogmas but discipline, meaning ideas as well as practices of religion, to make sure that they are compatible. So we looked at the dogmas to make sure that, contrary to common sense, they could not expose peaceful order to disturbances made all the more dangerous by the fact that the dogmatic ideas of happiness to come are combined with the zeal for God's glory and the submission to truths that are regarded as revelation. So only then, when we have examined those dogmas and purged them of dangerous elements, the elements which are dangerous to the sovereignty of capital, they have any right to exist. And if they can't be reformed, or then they must go, they must be destroyed like viruses. So that's the second strategy belongs more to the towards Islamic movements and things like that. But the first strategy was historically employed against Catholicism, and various forms of Protestantism as well. Even though the more drastic strategies were applied towards the more non conforming or non willing movements within Christianity as well. So, yeah, okay, I'll stop here and we'll continue from here.